Okay. Specific learning disabilities. So this is going to be a common one that you see. And what I want to say is when we're talking about a specific learning disability, oftentimes we're talking about a learning disability in math, a learning disability in reading. Dyslexia is a very specific kind of reading disability, and it's kind of specific learning disability is what the federal category is. So if somebody has a learning disability, we call it a specific learning disability in basic reading, a specific learning disability in reading comprehension, a specific learning disability in math calculation. So definitely, a lot of people say everybody thinks a reading disability is dyslexia. That's not true. It is a learning disability, but dyslexia is kind of a limited component. There's lots of different types of reading disabilities. And, oh, more people coming. So what I want to say is that in school-based, you'll see this quite a bit. Clinic-based also. And when we're looking at learning disabilities, what we often know is there are children who have language issues that do impact reading, phonology problems that maybe have impact reading, or tic issues that maybe have impact the phonics-based reading. So what I want to tell you is oftentimes when we start at the early age, so let's say early intervention, that birth to 3 group, the early preschool age group, so that we've got birth to 3 and then 3 to 5 is kind of the preschool group that I talk about. And what I've noticed over time, and this is just me as a clinician for however many years, is that if we have what we call a developmental delay, which I think is a better term for our group that we might work with in a school-based, so it's a school-based label. So developmental delay, what we see is if it takes them long to gain skills, oftentimes, it's not always, and it's not a one-to-one correspondence, but I do know if it seems that they take a long time, that can indicate some learning difficulties, even with intervention. So let's say we have a client we're working with, preschool age, so let's say 4, seems to be taking forever to learn basic concepts. And we're not real sure why. We've worked on it. They seem to have what I would call average intelligence. So sometimes somebody has a cognitive impairment that impacts their ability to learn at a fast pace. But what we notice too, if somebody doesn't really have a cognitive issue, it seems to take a long time to gain skills. I do know, that's from just I know, they're at high risk of what would later be called a learning disability. So learning disabilities should not be confused. So this is what I want to talk about. Problems that are primarily the result of visual issues. So you've got a visual problem, you're legally blind. Well, that's not a learning disability. That's a physical disability that impacts your ability to learn. Hearing, same thing. It's a hearing issue. You might have learning challenges because of a hearing issue, but the etiology is a hearing loss. A motor handicap. So some type of what I would say physical issue that impacts your ability, your motor abilities. Intellectual disabilities. So cognitive disabilities do impact someone to learn at a fast pace or understand things. As also, a lot of times you see intellectual disability and you also see language delay. So emotional disturbance or environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantages. So generally speaking, if we're going to term somebody with a learning disability, they typically have average to above average intelligence. So I do think that as a clinician, as a therapist, you're working in, someone says they have a learning disability, that is different than a developmental disability. So just know, you kind of, when we use these terms, they start to get muddled, but a learning disability is usually specific. They've got average cognitive intelligence. So if the client you're working with doesn't, then that might, some of their challenges with learning are more impacted by their cognitive skills. But so if someone's average intelligence and they still have difficulty learning, then that's where that learning disability comes into play. If you have a cognitive impairment, you will likely have challenges learning new skills, retaining new skills. If you have some other kind of what I would say major disability like hearing loss, a vision issue, that will impact your ability to hear and learn new things at a certain pace. But there's often a gap between the individual's potential and actual achievement. So that's where we're looking at identifying a learning disability. Typically, you need to have a cognitive test. So you need some kind of IQ test that looks at cognitive functioning, as well as an academic standardized test. So looking at the differences between their cognitive and their academics, there has to be a significant discrepancy between the two to get a learning disability category. And it's often why learning disabilities are referred to as hidden disabilities. But, and that's the challenge. So if I see a kid, and it's so funny because I can usually spot them about 4 years old after if I've worked with them since they've been 3 and I see, and we kind of get a good vibe on their cognitive skills. Attention's not a factor. Attention issue is an attention issue. And we're really definitely looking at, this is someone who's cognitively intact, they have good adaptive skills, and they still seem to struggle learning. Then I'm like, okay, that might be a true learning disability. So, and that's really what we see. We see average intelligence, everything else seems to be typical for that person, but they're still not able to learn. So that's a learning disability. It's kind of in absence of any other disability. And this is what we want to say. Learning disability cannot be cured or fixed. It's a lifelong challenge. So this is what we do know, is that there is typically a gap there always. But I kind of say this about people who have a learning disability. And it is an umbrella term. So I want to say learning disability can definitely be very broad, but it's kind of like you have to repeat it. They have to have repetition. And then once they get it, but it takes a long time to get it. So that's kind of the thing. They have the ability to get it and retain it, but the length of time it requires for them to get that skill takes a long time. So that's the challenge for somebody with a learning disability. And that's why sometimes school can be challenging, because they're not operating at the same pace. They're at one pace and the curriculum at school is operating on another pace, or the family at home is at one pace and the child's not operating at that pace. So definitely you'll see learning challenges in other ways, usually at home. But oftentimes when I hear parents say, well, it takes them a while, once they get it, they get it. I'm like, oh, okay, that's kind of my flag for, is that a potential learning disability? And so there are specific learning disabilities like dyslexia. So it's a specific type, and dysgraphia. So, and then I always say this wrong. It's so funny because like I said, I've told the last class, the psych I work with, it always sounds like he says he says it like, to me, Dracula, but it's dyscalculia. I never say it right, and he doesn't say it right, so that doesn't help matters. And he's always using these terms. Dysgraphia is another one where we're looking at handwriting. So see, my daughter seems to definitely have some of this stuff. So my second daughter, she seems to definitely have some learning challenges. It took her a long time to learn letters and sounds, and definitely some dysgraphia. She's writing everything, not letters backwards, but entire words. Like she would spell her entire name backwards. Like everything was a mirror image, but she would start at the end of the word. So not just the letters backwards, but the whole word. So it's strange. But definitely we see like illegible handwriting, inconsistent spacing, poor spatial planning. And really when we're looking at dysgraphia, they shouldn't have a motor impairment. So there's not another underlying motor issue that's impacting their ability to write legibly. So sometimes you can have a fine motor issue. That's why your handwriting is illegible. But then dysgraphia is where they've had instructions, they don't have an underlying motor issue, they still can't kind of form the words. So dyscalculia, understand numbers and math, dyslexia, oral written language disorder. So specific learning disability in written language, reading comp. Now there's a nonverbal learning disorder. I don't think we always see this well identified, and definitely a disorder which is usually characterized by a significant discrepancy between higher verbal skills and weaker motor, visual, spatial, and social skills. So typically somebody with a nonverbal learning disorder has trouble interpreting nonverbal cues like facial expressions, body language, and may have poor coordination. So I haven't had a whole, I've had a handful of clients with this. I don't think it's as well identified as maybe some of our other specific learning disabilities, but I definitely think there are people who struggle. They don't seem to have great language skills, high language, but they struggle with that, interpreting the facial cues, body language, facial expression. Other related disorders, ADHD. So there's you can read a lot of stuff about ADHD, but ADHD is not considered a learning disability. But what we do know, your attention is poor, you've missed out on instruction for a variety of reasons, whether you're hyperactive, can't sit and pay attention, or you look like you sit and pay attention, but you're checked out, so you're not getting the information. Over time, a lot of kids who have ADHD then also meet the criteria for a learning disability because their cognitive is high, but their academic score low. So there's a big discrepancy. Yeah, so we see that. I think, the causation, I don't know. But if you're not attending and you're not getting it, you kind of get a learning disability by default. And basically because you're not getting in that information, taking in, learning, absorbing it, utilizing it, executing it, then you develop a gap between your cognitive ability and your ability to learn. And then when you're missing out on some of those foundational skills, what happens is often the gap just widens. So that's the challenge. I don't know how else to make people understand ADHD. And I don't know, I think sometimes I don't want to say personal offense, but when someone's like, oh, my child just has ADHD, and yes, there are much more severe disorders, but are we able to manage it? Do we have strategies? Does this child have the ability to self-regulate, modulate, adjust themselves, have some of those coping mechanisms and compensatory strategies so their ADHD won't impact them? So that's the challenge that I do feel for, my own self and my attention issues. I wish that maybe they were handled differently, because I think what happens is you're not attending, and guess what happens too? Then your cognitive functioning declines. So just kind of the differences looking at someone, I'm not saying medications for everyone, but I do see so many academic things are improved if they have their ADHD managed. So definitely the ability to sit and use the cognitive process to learn oftentimes is helpful. So definitely there are things that, like for me, I know for me, I need to do some extreme physical exercise in order to focus and attend, be able to sit settled and take in information. If I don't have that input, I'm not ready, as I would say in zones of regulation, ready to learn. So, I think my parents did do a good job helping me understand myself in that regard, but I do think sometimes I wish it was managed a little different. I didn't manage it right until I became an adult, but it just creates gaps in your academics oftentimes. So dyspraxia. So there's apraxia that you've learned about. Dyspraxia, not a learning disability either, but we often see it with dyslexia, ADHD, and really what we see is problems with movement and coordination across the body. So it's not just speech wise. It's what I would call, we call it limb, it's more whole body dyspraxia. And to me, that's much more, that's neuro-based for sure, executive function. So there's a variety of ways when we talk about executive function, and that's really that frontal cortex. So that's that planning, organization, strategizing, paying attention to and remembering details, managing time and space. And although not a learning disability, but it definitely can impact their ability to be ready to learn, to organize information that they are learning. And oftentimes we see difficulties with someone who has a specific learning disability also have issues with executive function. So be familiar with those and what those look like. Now, written language. So on like an IEP, you'll see specific learning disability in written language. And then there's usually a goal to address it. Specific learning disability in reading comprehension. Specific learning disability in math calculation and math problem solving. So kind of looking at those areas, written language, math, reading. You can also have a specific learning disability in listening comp and oral expression. So oftentimes what I do, and I work with my psychologist, is if somebody has a severe language impairment, so we're looking at that broad language impairment, it's not just a speech language impairment, especially when we're looking at, middle school, high school age. I'm usually advocating for them to meet the criteria of a specific learning disability in oral expression or listening comp, which really to me, oral expression is expressive language, listening comp, receptive language, especially if their language impairment is significant enough. There are some other academic tests that I work with the psych to do that if the language impairment is impacting their ability, then to me, it's more of a learning disability. And especially what I usually advocate for those people to get that label if they've been in intervention, they've been getting speech therapy, they've been working on goals and things are just not progressing and they don't have a cognitive impairment. There's no other reason for why they're not learning the information, that I usually advocate for that by the time in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, so they can get all the academic help in a school-based setting. So yeah, SPED teachers aren't real fans of that because that's really more of what I call the global speech issue, but definitely some challenges there, but be familiar with the different types of learning disabilities. One second. Oh, whoops, that's the wrong page. Sorry. There isn't a presentation. 1 minute. You guys don't see that. So I do like this is a nice summary. Like I said, I want to say, yeah, no two individuals with the learning disability are alike. So you're going to hear that in every kind of disorder we talk about. No two are alike. This is absolutely true. What we do know when we look at reading, there's some definite patterns, some what I say stereotypical things that we see, writing for sure. And here's the challenge, you guys. When someone has deficits in reading, what happens next? Then they often have deficits in writing. So oftentimes when they meet the criteria for reading, they, not always, not every time, but often meet the criteria in writing also. And the next challenge is then they struggle in math because they can't read the math problems. So then they struggle maybe in math problem solving when they have to independently read the problem. So we definitely tease that out in a academic sense. And for instance, let's say you're working in a clinic and your supervisor did an evaluation, recommended therapy, and oftentimes, definitely talk to your clients. Do they have an IEP? Do they have another diagnosed disorder from a school? Because I think that it helps you set your mind, because if you hear specific learning disability, that should give you a clue that maybe it takes them a while to learn things. So sometimes I think as a clinician, as a therapist, I get frustrated when, clinic-based, I'm like, okay, well, I feel like they should be improving on this figurative language piece. I feel like they should be improving on these inferencing. I've been working on it, addressing, and they're usually engaged. They're usually actually great clients to work with. But you just feel like, why are they not learning it? And you get a little frustrated, definitely, because it's like, what's that piece? And then that's where I think you have to kind of definitely look at the bigger picture. Does it take them a while to learn things? And if it is, then it's likely them, not you. So we try to engage, we try to help speed it along. I'd like to say we always can, but we can't always. But they need that repetition. That repetition is key. You got to look at oral language, math, that executive function part is the study skills, social skills. This is what we also know is if they have a type of learning disorder, often they're at risk at some nonverbal learning disorders. So that's where we might need to revisit some things that we've done with other disorders. We might need to revisit pragmatic language. We might need to revisit like looking at nonverbal communication. What are the cues? What is if you're the speaker, what's your listener doing? So those are definitely some key pieces that we look at. So here's some strategies. So I like this kind of, and definitely when I'm working with the high schoolers in transition and college base, definitely using the Disability Center on campus, especially if they have a diagnosed learning disability or ADHD or some other type of disorder. Use the resources on a college campus or in a job-based training program, because what's oftentimes is those people are well versed in how to support somebody with a learning disability. Writing lab for sure. There's usually a math lab, writing lab on a campus. Use them. They will support you, doing your best regardless of your disability. So definitely some, strategies, both in writing and verbally. So oftentimes we want to make sure they understand the directions, especially if they struggle with reading. So they might need more of that verbal piece versus the reading piece. Math, so let's take things with math. Sometimes we need to help keep their numbers organized. So a lot of times there's special paper, things to help organize the page. They might need a model. So if you want the page set up, so I appreciate this. A biology teacher is great. She wants a lab written. So every time she has a lab posted, she has the model of what the paper should look like. Where should all the information be so she always gives a model, and definitely helpful for anybody with a variety of disabilities. Definitely sometimes you need a model of what it needs to look like. Now, that caveat, you don't ever want to copy something word for word. You want to make it your own always. So, how to compensate for a reading disability. And I will say nowadays with technology, we see a lot more compensatory options in assistive tech. So the speech to text, the reading, where they read the text to you, definitely is helpful. I know students at my school just took AZ Merit. Really great that in all things except the reading, it read them the prompts, it read them the answers, it read every part of the test except when we were testing reading. Definitely helpful. And it just read it for them. You could press a button, it reads it, repeats it. You can even pick the voice, you could pick the pace. So definitely some things that I think is more readily available for some of our people with disabilities, which is really awesome to see. So less barriers for them. So other strategies, I definitely like all of the strategies. You can see the characteristics, strategies. So definitely math, a lot of manipulatives help them. I think that's good teaching strategies anyway, but definitely sometimes special paper or ways to help keep their numbers where they need to be. So like when you hear about dyslexia and they talk about letters jumping around the page, that can happen also in math. So definitely some of those same characteristics that happen with reading and letters can happen with numbers. So I have a fifth grader right now that I think is pretty severe. You can't ever trust his numbers that he copies or that he writes down. So we're working on some compensatory strategies for him. But some good information in the read and review. There's a little video you can watch. Oh, I did show you that one. Okay, so go back to the module. 1 second. Sorry, it might make you guys sick when I scroll like that. Apologize. So there is just a quiz and a read and review summary. So be familiar with the vocabulary for the quiz. So, what did you learn about all the different types of learning disabilities? What do you think is the most important aspect that you need to remember when working with someone with a learning disability? So what we do know is often they have speech and language delays. And that's where what's nice is when you're able to work in a team. So it's nice if you have access to a SPED teacher or the, what does she call herself? A disability tutor. So people who are well-versed in strategies and work on using strategies. I feel like that's real popular in the Midwest. I feel like they're becoming more popular here. Kind of heard that term. And what's nice is that if we also empower clients to understand their disability. So if we know someone has a learning disability, oftentimes from a speech and language perspective, we're also teaching them how to communicate about it, how to maybe numbers they're not going to be an accountant if they have dyscalculia. And, maybe explaining that to people. Hey, when I write things down, I just might need a check, or, hey, numbers can get confusing. Can I have your business card? Something like that. So these are compensatory strategies we work on to help them accommodate their issue. So definitely some things to remember. So for instance, I did work with a teacher at a pretty significant, she was math SLD in all areas. And so if somebody wrote down an address or wrote down a phone number, she would oftentimes not write it down. She would have them write it down. Like, can you write down your number? Can you write down your address? Because she always mixed up the numbers. So definitely some things that, she learned how to help compensate in an appropriate way. So that's oftentimes from a speech perspective, we're teaching them how to advocate and communicate to others to help lessen the impact of their disability within their day. So there's definitely some easy strategies to use. She was great. I felt like she was a good model for a lot of students. I did enjoy working with her when I had the opportunity. But she was open with all of us about it, which was helpful to know to, support her too. But she was great at teaching the kids on how to advocate for themselves. So, and then the final. So there's a study guide posted. Please know, and I'm going to update the dates. I believe everything needs to be done by the 21st, because I do believe grades are due Monday. So I need to double check on that, but I will post, so check announcements. I'm getting grades updated. And is there any other questions? Alrighty, if not, I appreciate you guys joining me. And there are no office hours next week, so I'll put some reminders and announcements, but definitely, get it done. We're almost done.